Who could imagine that one mistake could open the door to a completely different life? On a rainy evening, a poor girl knocked on the wrong apartment door, expecting nothing more than another delivery. But when the door opened, she found a man in a suit with red eyes, tears still fresh on his face. She thought it was just a stranger having a bad day, but what she didn't know was that he was a millionaire, carrying a grief so heavy that her presence would change everything. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. A thin drizzle slid down the windows of the old apartment building, turning the concrete gray into something even colder. Alina adjusted the worn strap of the delivery bag slung across her shoulder, her shoes damp from running through puddles. She was late again, not because she wanted to be, but because every extra delivery meant a little more money to pay for her tuition, her rent, her younger brother's medicine. The building smelled of dust and stale air, and the elevator was out of order, so she climbed the stairwell with aching legs, counting each step under her breath. Fourth floor, apartment 412, she repeated, reading the smudged note on the paper. She stopped before the door, brushed wet hair away from her cheek, and knocked lightly. For a moment there was no sound, only the muffled hum of rain outside. Then footsteps echoed. The door opened slowly, as if whoever stood behind it wasn't expecting anyone. A tall man appeared in the doorway, his shirt half-buttoned, sleeves rolled up, a tie hanging loose around his neck. His eyes caught her first, steel gray, red at the edges, as though he hadn't slept for days. Wrong apartment. His voice was deep but unsteady. Alina blinked, suddenly unsure. She glanced down at her paper, then at the number stenciled beside the door. 422, not 412. Her stomach dropped. She had climbed one floor too high. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, cheeks heating. "I was supposed to deliver to," but her words trailed off when she noticed the inside of the apartment. Behind him, the hallway was scattered with toys, a small train track, a stuffed bear slumped against the wall, crayons spilled across a low table. Dust had begun to settle on them, like no child's hands had touched them in months. The sight pierced something inside her chest. The man followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. He stepped forward slightly, as though to block her view, but not quickly enough. His hand brushed against the doorframe, clenched white with restraint. And then she saw it. His eyes shimmered, not just tired, but breaking. A single tear slipped down his cheek before he wiped it away roughly with the back of his hand. Alina swallowed, unsure if she should apologize again or simply retreat. Yet something stopped her. Maybe it was the loneliness in the way he stood, or the silence that felt heavier than words. She had seen exhaustion before, her mother after double shifts, neighbors after endless days. But this was different. This man looked as if he carried not just work, but grief itself. I really am sorry for disturbing you," she whispered, her voice softer now. "I'll go." He shook his head almost imperceptibly, as though the interruption had startled him out of a dark thought. "No, it's fine," he murmured, though his eyes didn't meet hers. He cleared his throat, trying for composure, but his voice cracked anyway. "It's fine." She shifted awkwardly, hugging the strap of her bag. Her instincts told her to step away, leave the stranger to his sorrow, but another part of her lingered. Maybe because she knew what it was like to cry behind closed doors, where no one asked questions. Maybe because the apartment felt too quiet, like a cage of memories. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally, she blurted out, "The bear. He looks like he's waiting for someone to pick him up." The man froze, following her eyes to the stuffed toy on the floor. For a second his expression cracked wide open, grief surging raw and unguarded across his face. His hand twitched as though he wanted to slam the door, but instead he whispered hoarsely, "He was." Alina's breath caught. She understood then. She didn't know details, didn't know the story, but she recognized the kind of silence that follows loss. It was the same silence she had lived with after her father's accident, when the world expected her to keep moving while her home fell apart. He stepped back, half turning into the apartment, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might tell her to come in. But instead, he just leaned against the doorframe, one hand covering his eyes. His shoulders shook once, barely perceptible. Alina didn't move. She didn't pity him. Pity was useless. She simply stood there, quiet but present, her own throat tight. Sometimes that was all anyone needed. Not solutions, not words, just proof they weren't completely invisible. Finally, he lowered his hand and met her gaze again. His eyes were red, yes, but beneath the grief there was a flicker of something else, bewilderment, maybe even relief. As though he couldn't believe a stranger had seen him like this and hadn't turned away. She gave him the faintest smile, not of cheer but of understanding. "Take care," she whispered, and stepped back. Before she could leave, his voice stopped her. Quiet, raw but certain. "What's your name?" Alina hesitated at the stairwell, her fingers tightening around the railing. She shouldn't tell him. She was just a courier, just passing through, and this was not her place. Yet something made her turn. "Alina," she said softly. He nodded once, almost as if committing it to memory, then let the door close gently. As she descended the stairs, her pulse still racing, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that she had knocked on more than just the wrong door. She had stumbled into someone's private grief, and somehow, for reasons she couldn't explain, he had let her see it. And upstairs, behind the closed door, the man, Adrian Cole, a name known in boardrooms and newspapers, stood frozen, whispering her name again under his breath. Not because she was anyone special, but because, for the first time in years, when he opened the door with tears in his eyes, someone hadn't looked away. The next morning, Alina told herself she would forget the strange encounter. After all, it wasn't her business who lived behind that door, or why he had looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. She had too many things to worry about. Exams in 2 weeks, her part-time shift at the café, and her younger brother Daniel who needed medication they could barely afford. Life did not leave space for curiosity about strangers. Yet, as she rushed between deliveries, her mind kept returning to that man's face, the way his voice had cracked when he whispered a single word about the stuffed bear. Adrian Cole, meanwhile, sat in his sleek office on the 22nd floor of a glass tower. The city moved restlessly below, cars threading through rain-streaked streets, but from his window it all looked distant, like a life he no longer belonged to. His assistant handed him files, investors called, contracts needed his signature, yet he barely heard them. All morning, one word repeated in his head, Alina. A simple name, spoken softly by a girl who should have been just another courier and nothing more. But for some reason, when she stood in his doorway, he had not felt like a millionaire, nor a man defined by headlines. He had simply felt human. That evening, Alina's shift at the cafe stretched longer than expected. The rain had returned, bringing in customers who wanted warmth and coffee. She tied her apron tighter, moving quickly between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease. She hated the uniform. It was too big, smelling faintly of detergent, but at least it paid. Near closing time, a tall man entered. His coat was damp, hair darker from the rain. He chose a table in the corner, away from the soft chatter. Alina didn't notice him at first. Her hands were full carrying plates back to the kitchen. But when she turned with a menu, her heart stopped. It was him, the man from the wrong door. She froze for half a second, caught between recognition and disbelief. He looked different here, sharper, composed, like he belonged to another world. His shirt was pressed, his tie knotted properly. His presence quietly commanding, yet his eyes gave him away. The same tired gray, the same sadness buried too deep. "Good evening," he said, his voice steadier than before, but gentler too, as if he wasn't sure whether she would remember. Alina cleared her throat, forcing her professionalism to surface. "Welcome. Would you like to see the menu?" He studied her, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. You work here? Yes, she replied quickly, uncomfortable with his observation. I work a lot of places. He accepted the menu, though he hardly glanced at it. Instead, he looked at her like he wanted to say more. She shifted under his gaze, unsure if she should retreat or wait. Finally, he said softly, "Thank you for yesterday." She blinked. "I didn't do anything." "You stayed," he said. That was more than anyone else. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say she had just been awkward, that leaving felt rude. But something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't flattery. It was truth, spoken with a rawness that pressed against her heart. Alina scribbled his order quickly, a black coffee, nothing else, and escaped to the counter. Her hands shook slightly as she poured it. Why did his presence unsettle her? He wasn't a friend, not family, not even a customer she knew by name. Just a stranger whose grief had spilled into her path. And yet, when she carried the cup to his table, her eyes betrayed her, lingering on the curve of his jaw, the faint stubble that hadn't been there yesterday, the way his hands curled loosely around the porcelain mug as if anchoring himself. The cafe thinned out as closing time neared. Adrian remained, staring at the dark liquid in his cup, untouched. Alina wiped tables, her back turned, trying not to notice him. When she finally approached, he looked up. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years, she said cautiously. "Evenings, mostly. Daytime I study. Psychology." Something shifted in his gaze, an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition. Like her words carried weight he couldn't explain. "Psychology," he repeated slowly. "You want to help people?" She shrugged. "I want to understand them. Maybe that's the same thing." For the first time, he smiled. Faint, almost fragile, but real. The kind of smile that made her heart clench unexpectedly. He opened his mouth to speak again, but just then the manager called her from the kitchen. She excused herself, relief and confusion tangled inside her chest. When she returned minutes later, his table was empty. Only the cup remained, untouched, a folded bill tucked beneath it. Too much money for one coffee. She frowned, annoyed. Did he think she needed charity? She considered running after him, giving it back, but something else caught her eye, a napkin beside the bill, with one word written in neat handwriting. Alina. Her name. Her hands trembled as she held it. She had not told him this time. He had remembered. And somewhere outside, walking into the rain, Adrian Cole wondered why a girl who knocked on the wrong door now occupied his every thought. The napkin stayed with Alina, folded carefully in her pocket as if it were something fragile. She told herself not to read too much into it. People remembered names. It meant nothing. But late that night, when she finally returned to the small apartment she shared with her brother, she found herself staring at it again, tracing the careful strokes of handwriting. Her brother Daniel was already asleep, his breathing uneven but steady. The bottle of medicine on the counter was almost empty, and the next refill would mean skipping meals for her. Reality pressed hard, reminding her she had no time for daydreams about strangers with gray eyes. She tucked the napkin into her notebook and turned off the light, forcing herself to sleep. Adrian, meanwhile, sat in the back of his black car, the city's neon reflections sliding across the tinted windows. His driver asked where to, and Adrian gave an address without thinking. His office, though he knew no paperwork would hold his attention tonight. Instead, he stared at his own reflection in the glass. He had built an empire from nothing, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, silenced boardrooms with a single glance. Yet none of it had prepared him for the sound of a girl's voice saying she wanted to understand people. That voice clung to him like a lifeline, pulling him back towards something he hadn't realized he still wanted: connection. The next days passed in restless rhythm. Alina worked longer shifts, her delivery routes stretching further. Each time she passed the building where she had knocked on the wrong door, her chest tightened. She forced herself not to look at the windows, not to wonder if he was there. But one evening, when she left the cafe late, she noticed a figure across the street. A man leaning against a lamppost, coat collar turned up against the wind. She felt the prickle of awareness before she recognized him. Adrian. He stepped forward slowly, not intruding, just waiting until her eyes met his. "You forgot this," he said softly, holding out a black umbrella. It wasn't hers, she realized, but he pressed it into her hands anyway, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to," she began. "Rain's getting worse," he interrupted gently, glancing at the sky. "And you shouldn't walk home without one." His concern unsettled her. Nobody outside her family ever thought about her safety. She wanted to hand the umbrella back, to remind him she wasn't his responsibility. But his gaze held hers, steady and quiet, and something inside her softened. She nodded once, clutching the handle. "Thank you." They walked side by side for a few blocks, the umbrella sheltering them both. The silence between them was not heavy this time, but strange, almost fragile. Finally, Adrian asked, "How old is your brother?" Her head whipped toward him. "How do you?" "You mentioned him once," he said calmly. "At the cafe, when you asked for an extra shift." She exhaled slowly, realizing he had listened more carefully than she thought. "Daniel's 12. He's sick, sometimes." She didn't explain further. Adrian nodded, not prying. But in his mind, calculations had already begun. Contacts at hospitals, specialists he could call, resources he could offer. Yet he stopped himself. If he said anything now, she would run. He needed her to see him as a man, not a bank account. When they reached her street, Alina hesitated. Her apartment building looked small and tired next to him, a symbol of two worlds colliding. She turned to return the umbrella, but he raised a hand. "Keep it." She searched his face, trying to understand why a man like him, elegant, powerful, clearly belonging to a life far above hers, would linger in her shadows. But the words caught in her throat. She simply nodded and slipped inside. From his car parked down the street, Adrian watched the light turn on in her window. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. The following week, their paths kept crossing. Sometimes it was by chance, sometimes not. He stopped by the cafe more often, always choosing her section, always ordering the same untouched black coffee. Once, she caught him watching her help an elderly woman carry a tray, his expression unreadable but softer than she had ever seen. Another time, he passed her in the stairwell of the old building where she delivered packages. Neither spoke, but their eyes met, and the silence between them felt alive. One evening, as the cafe emptied, Alina finally asked, "Why do you come here if you never drink your coffee?" Adrian smiled faintly, tilting his head. "Maybe I'm waiting for something else." Her heart stumbled, but she forced a laugh. "That's not a very good excuse. You're wasting money." "Money isn't the point," he said simply, his voice low enough that it sent a shiver through her. She turned away quickly, pretending to wipe the counter. His words lingered long after he left, and that night she pressed the napkin with her name tighter between the pages of her notebook, as if it had begun to mean something she was afraid to name. But what she didn't know was that someone else had started to notice. A man in a sharp suit, Adrian's business partner, had seen him enter the cafe more than once. He had watched the way Adrian's expression changed inside those modest walls. And he didn't like it. Not one bit. The storm that revealed everything didn't come with thunder, but with whispers. Alina arrived at the cafe one Friday evening to find her manager unusually flustered, adjusting his tie and hurrying between tables. She quickly discovered why. A group of sharply dressed men occupied the corner booth, their suits crisp, their watches glinting under the yellow lights. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing occasionally toward the door as if expecting someone important. Alina avoided them, focusing on her tasks, but when the bell above the entrance chimed, her breath caught. Adrian walked in, not in his rain-damp coat or rumpled shirt, not with eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, but in his full armor, tailored suit, polished shoes, presence like a thundercloud of quiet authority. The men at the booth stood immediately, shaking his hand with deference. One of them leaned close, murmuring something that made the others laugh nervously. Adrian's face remained impassive, but his eyes flicked once, almost instinctively, toward Alina behind the counter. She froze, tray balanced in her hand. It was as though two versions of him collided. The man in the doorway with tears in his eyes, and this commanding figure the world seemed to bow before. Her stomach knotted. The manager hurried over, nearly tripping in his eagerness. "Mr. Cole, welcome. I didn't know you'd be." Adrian's hand lifted subtly, silencing him. His voice was calm, measured. "I'm just here for coffee." But the name lingered in the air like a crack of lightning. Cole. Alina had heard it before. In newspapers she skimmed when customers left them behind, in snippets of conversations on the street. Adrian Cole, the reclusive millionaire, the man who owned half the real estate in the city, the man whose empire weathered storms that crushed others. She stared at him, blood rushing in her ears. So this was the truth. He caught her gaze, and something flickered in his eyes, almost a plea, as if he was silently asking her not to see him differently. But she couldn't stop the wave of anger that rose. Why hadn't he told her? Why let her think he was just some grieving stranger in a quiet apartment? Why linger around her world of cheap coffee and crumbling stairwells without saying who he really was? Her hands shook as she placed cups before the suited men, their laughter grating. One of them smirked at her, whispering too loudly. "No wonder he's been disappearing. Found himself a distraction." His tone dripped with condescension, making her cheeks burn. She glanced at Adrian, waiting for him to dismiss the remark, but he only set his jaw tighter, offering no defense. That silence stung worse than the insult. She finished her shift in a blur, avoiding his eyes. When the cafe closed, she stepped out into the drizzle, pulling her thin jacket tight. She barely made it 2 blocks before she heard footsteps behind her. "Alina." His voice cut through the rain. She kept walking. "Please," he said, quickening his pace until he reached her side. His suit was darkened by rain now, but he didn't seem to notice. "Let me explain." She stopped abruptly, turning on him. "Explain what? That you're rich? That you let me believe you were just some man with broken toys in his hallway? Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to realize I've been sitting across from someone people write about in newspapers?" His face tightened, not in anger, but in something close to pain. "I didn't tell you because I needed someone to see me, not my money. For once, I wanted," he trailed off, searching for words. "I wanted to be just a man." Her chest ached, but the anger didn't dissolve. "You don't get to decide how I see you. You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth." The rain fell harder, splattering against the pavement. He stood there, water dripping from his hair, his expression raw. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I should have." But she shook her head, stepping back. "It doesn't matter. You live in a world I don't belong to." She turned before he could answer, walking fast, refusing to look back. She heard him call her name once more, the sound echoing down the empty street. But she didn't stop. Not this time. When she finally reached her apartment, breathless and trembling, she pressed her back against the door and slid to the floor. Daniel stirred from his sleep, murmuring her name, but she forced a smile and told him everything was fine. Only when the lights were off did she let herself cry silently into the sleeve of her jacket, furious at him, furious at herself for caring. And blocks away, Adrian stood in the rain long after she had gone, his driver waiting helplessly by the car. He whispered her name again into the storm, the sound swallowed by thunder, and wondered if he had just lost the only person who had seen him as more than his empire. The days that followed stretched unbearably long. Alina buried herself in work, stacking shifts back to back, too exhausted to think once she collapsed onto her thin mattress at night. She avoided the streets near his office towers, avoided looking at newspapers with his name on them. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't silence the memory of the way he had whispered her name in the rain, like it was the only word he had left to hold on to. Daniel noticed her distraction. One evening, As she reheated soup on the stove, he asked quietly, "Why are you sad?" His eyes were sharper than most gave him credit for. She forced a smile, brushing his hair back. "I'm not. Just tired." But later, when he was asleep, she admitted to herself the truth. She missed Adrian. Not his wealth, not his presence in the cafe, but the man in the doorway, broken yet human, the one who had looked at her like she was the only steady thing in his collapsing world. That man felt real. The millionaire she had glimpsed in the cafe felt like someone else entirely, a stranger behind glass. Adrian, on the other hand, tried to drown himself in work. Meetings, numbers, negotiations. It was the language he had mastered to silence his mind. But every time a pen slipped from his hand or he caught his reflection in a boardroom window, he saw her face. The girl who hadn't looked away when he opened the wrong door to his grief. The girl who walked away when she discovered the truth. On the third evening, he made a decision. Not a business calculation, not a strategy, just a man's choice. When Alina returned home late from a shift, rain dripping from her hair, she found a small package at her door. No name, just plain brown paper. Warily, she brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. Daniel leaned over curiously as she untied the string. Inside was a worn stuffed bear, its stitching mended carefully, a ribbon tied around its neck. Her breath caught. She recognized it immediately, the same bear she had seen slumped against the wall in Adrian's hallway. But now, around its paw, was a folded sheet of paper. She opened it with trembling hands. "Alina," it read in strong, deliberate handwriting. "I don't want to give you money. I don't want to offer favors. I want to give you the only thing I've held on to since the day my world broke. The courage to let someone else hold the weight with me. This bear belonged to my son. I thought I would never let it leave my home. But somehow, when you knocked on the wrong door, you opened the right one inside me. If you can forgive me, come back. Not to my empire, not to my name. Just to me." Her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. She traced the words again and again, her tears falling silently onto the paper. She had no idea how long she sat there, the bear resting on her lap, Daniel asleep in the other room. The next morning, she found herself climbing the same stairwell where everything had begun. Her heart pounded with each step. She hesitated at the door, fingers trembling. This time, she wasn't here by mistake. She knocked once. The door opened almost immediately, as though he had been standing on the other side, waiting. Adrian's eyes met hers. No suit today, no armor. Just a man in a simple sweater, hair slightly disheveled, breath caught in disbelief. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alina held out the bear with shaking hands. "Some doors are worth knocking on twice." His expression broke, relief flooding through him. Raw and unguarded. He took the bear gently, then her hands, his grip careful as though afraid she might vanish again. "Thank you," he whispered, voice rough, "for giving me another chance." She swallowed the lump in her throat, searching his face. "No more secrets." "No more," he promised. The silence that followed was not empty this time. It was filled with something fragile, tender, and real. Behind him, the apartment still held shadows of loss. But for the first time, there was light too. The possibility of laughter, of warmth, of a future not built on riches but on the quiet miracle of being seen. Adrian stepped aside, inviting her in. And as she crossed the threshold, Alina realized she hadn't just knocked on the wrong door that rainy evening. She had opened the only one that mattered. Weeks turned into months, and the rain that once marked their beginning became a quiet memory they both carried. Alina still worked at the cafe, though fewer shifts now. Adrian insisted she focus on her studies, but she refused to give up the job entirely. "It keeps me grounded," she told him, and he only smiled, admiring the stubborn spark that had drawn him to her from the start. Daniel grew stronger under better medical care, though neither Adrian nor Alina ever spoke of how hospital bills seemed to vanish quietly. She suspected his hand behind it, but she let it be, because he never mentioned it and never used it as proof of his love. His proof came in simpler ways. Waiting outside with an umbrella when her shift ended, cooking dinner badly just to make her laugh, learning her brother's favorite board games. Sometimes, late at night, Adrian would sit with the bear between them, telling her stories of his son, the way he used to laugh, the way he always demanded one more bedtime story. Alina never interrupted, never rushed him. She simply listened, her hand resting over his, reminding him that memories didn't have to stay locked behind grief. And on one particularly bright morning, when sunlight filled the apartment that once felt like a tomb, Adrian caught her in the doorway, the same doorway where their story began. She was carrying grocery bags, hair loose around her shoulders, humming softly to herself. He leaned against the frame, watching her with a smile that carried no sorrow this time, only gratitude. "You still knock before coming in," he teased gently. She turned, arching an eyebrow. "Maybe I like the reminder that the wrong door brought me to the right place." He reached for her hand, kissed her fingers softly, and whispered, "Not wrong. Never wrong." And as laughter and life filled the rooms that once held silence, both of them understood. Sometimes fate doesn't need grand gestures. Sometimes all it takes is a single knock to change everything.